The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Does Canada need a temporary foreign worker program? Our guests debate the pros and cons of a controversial policy. Then, journalist and author Tanya Talega talks to Jayan Jagannathan about her new book, The Knowing. That's tonight on The Agenda. The federal government announced changes to the temporary foreign worker program, reducing the number of workers employers can hire in an effort to weed out what it considers misuse and fraud in the system. Joining us now to discuss the implications of these changes on businesses, workers, and the economy, we welcome, from the nation's capital, Mike Moffat, director of the Smart Prosperity Institute. In the Willowdale neighborhood of Ontario's capital city, Dan Kelly, CEO and president of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. And with us here in studio, Elizabeth Long, immigration lawyer for Long Mangalji LLP. And Jim Stanford, economist and director of the Center for Future Work. And it's great to have you two with us back here in our studio. And to Dan and Mike in Points Beyond, we're grateful for your participation today as well. This is one of these really controversial, fraught issues. So, Elizabeth, I often like to bring us back to first principles here and just give people a sense about what it is we're talking about. The temporary foreign worker program essentially is what?
So the temporary foreign worker program, it's been in place for quite a long time, several decades. And what it is, it's a very small subset of the total numbers of work permits that people can have. Essentially, in order to get a work permit under the temporary foreign worker program, the employer has to go to the market, the labor market, and test the labor market through a process called the Labor Market Impact Assessment, LMIA. To get a labor market impact assessment, in general, they have to advertise and try to hire Canadians, or they have to promise the government that they are going to provide labor market benefits, such as hiring more Canadians or training Canadians as well.
And here's what the numbers have looked like. We got one of these fancy charts here, and for those of you listening on podcast, I'll read out some of the numbers here so you can see how it's gone over the last decade. There were more than 160,000 temporary foreign worker positions in Canada in 2013. Then, as the years go on, as we get towards 2016, the numbers start to dip. But then more recently, they achieve levels in the last couple of years of nearly 240,000. So, Jim, you have been following this for more than a decade. What story do you think that bar graph tells?
Well, in general, it's employers who are trying to bring in workers from other countries on a temporary basis to meet their recruitment and retention needs. So what we have seen, particularly since the pandemic, when, number one, there was all the disruptions in retail and hospitality and other industries where employers had a hard time attracting back their workers when the economy reopened. Number two, the unemployment rate was relatively low, at least for a while. It's not so low anymore. So in that environment, employers were pushing hard to liberalize this program, to open it up, and the government listened to employers. So particularly in 2022, they relaxed some of the rules and limits on the temporary foreign worker program. And employers went to town with it. They took advantage of those openings, and they hired a lot more people from overseas to come on a temporary basis. And this program, as Elizabeth mentioned, is just one part of a much bigger issue about non-permanent migration to Canada. So there are other programs, the International Mobility Program, for example, or international students who are allowed to work here more hours than in the past, that in a way play a similar role in the labor market, helping employers meet their demands for low-wage, accessible labor, but with some implications for how the overall labor market's working.
We have someone here who represents employers. So Dan Kelly, it's over to you. You saw that graph. What story do you think it tells?
Well, look, I've been involved in each piece of that graph, both when it's going up and going down. Certainly in 2013, there was a big crackdown on the program, and then the numbers dipped, and now it's come back up. Jim said it absolutely right. After the pandemic, the labor market was effectively broken. Employers were screaming for staff, and I don't blame many of the staff who had been hired, laid off, as Canada locked down more than virtually any other country in the world. So we needed people. We needed them badly. The nice thing about the temporary foreign worker program is it is a dial. You can turn it up when the labor market is tight and turn it down when the labor market is a little bit softer. And effectively, that's what the government has done. I worry that the turning down may be a little bit too swift, and I'm certainly hearing from a lot of employers who are pretty freaked out. But we need a program like this because Canada's labor market is fairly finely tuned.
Mike, let me get your view on why you think that dial gets turned up or turned down. What provokes the turning up or turning down of that dial?
Yeah, whenever we have periods of low unemployment, that's challenging for employers. And federal government listens to those complaints and finds ways to bring in more workers. And I don't think that's necessarily a sensible approach, that we should be looking at periods of low unemployment as a crisis. I think we should be looking at it as an opportunity to train people. But, we have this situation where, again, employers complain to the government listens and deregulates it. Then we find ourselves in periods like today, like Jim describes, where unemployment gets high, and then folks start complaining, and parents like me start complaining that their kids can't get summer jobs, and the government dials it back down again.
All right, let's go through what some of the recent changes are that the federal government has brought in. And to that end, I'll get, again, our director, Sheldon Osmond, to bring this graphic up. And for those listening on podcast, here we go. The federal government announced that by September 26th of this year, it will no longer process its assessments of the low-wage stream, you heard Elizabeth talking about that, the low-wage stream in metropolitan areas with an unemployment rate of 6% or higher. Now, with exceptions in seasonal and non-seasonal jobs in food security sectors, construction, and healthcare. Employers should have no more than 10% of their total workforce through the temporary foreign worker program, 10%. And the maximum duration of employment for workers hired through the low-wage stream will be reduced to 1 year. It used to be 2 years. Okay, we talked about the dial being ramped up and ramped down. It's a pretty clear ramping down in this situation, so let's get some reactions. Jim, what does this look like to you?
I'd say that's a pretty modest twist of the dial, to tell you the truth, Steve. And
you
remember,
want it turned harder?
I think so in some areas. And remember, this is just one piece of a bigger temporary migration labor system that we have. We've still got those other streams. We've got the high wage stream. We've got the international mobility program. We've got hundreds of thousands of international students, in some cases, who come here mostly to work. So what would you have preferred the government do if this doesn't turn the dial enough in your view? Right. Well, I think that we should be eliminating the low-wage option for some occupations. There's just no reason why, just because it's hard for a restaurant to find somebody to work for minimum wage, that we should thereby say, okay, somebody from outside of the country is willing to accept that minimum wage, bring them in. Instead, we should be holding employers' feet to the fire to say, look, if you're having a hard time recruiting workers, offer them a better deal, offer them better wages, offer them better hours, which is often more important than the wage, offer them some benefits.
Dan, what do you say?
Look, there's zero employees coming under the temporary foreign worker program at the minimum wage or even near the minimum wage. The government sets the prevailing wage rate in the industry. It's often set at a rate that is higher than many employers pay their Canadian workers, especially for smaller employers who struggle to meet some of these lines. The employer has to pay between about $7,500 to $15,000 in fees and airfare to bring the low-wage worker in and out of Canada. This is not a low-wage program. There's zero evidence this is leading to wage suppression, which is one of the boogeymen that's often touted at this time. Employers need this because there are occupational categories and regions in the country that are really tough to find people. We've started to get our heads around, and I think most people acknowledge that young kids are not lining up to take jobs on the farms in the summer, and so it makes sense to bring in seasonal agricultural workers. But that's increasingly true for other sectors of the economy. I was just talking to a person in Newfoundland and Labrador that has no problems finding certain types of occupations, but for their night shifts in their warehouse, they can find no one, even after they've jacked up wages, and they're struggling to find workers, and it's the temporary foreign workers who have been a godsend in protecting the Canadian jobs in industries like that.
Elizabeth, in your view, did the federal government turn down the dial too much or not enough, or what?
I think when we have blanket statements such as we don't need people in certain categories, it really affects us when situations are very nuanced. You know, for example, the situation in Newfoundland. In those cases, the employer just isn't able to do so. When we're talking about LMIA, the employer really has to show that they just can't find people who want to work at the median wage that the government has said. This is what the industry says is the median wage. They just can't find people there. And I'd like to talk about the broader picture because the temporary foreign worker program is just a very, very small, I think it's probably around maybe 10% of the total amount of people who are here on work permits or who are allowed to work as students. And the vast majority of people who are here on the work permits are not affected by, you know, this area, which is the most regulated area of work permits. Vast majority of people are here who have obtained their work permits after they've graduated from university or college, or who have been granted humanitarian work permits such as the Ukraine work permit QAT, the Iranian, the list goes on for that. For example, just on the Ukrainian QAT program, there was almost 300,000 people who have come to Canada under that program.
From that one country.
From that one country. So when we're talking about, oh, there's a lot of workers out there who are not Canadians or permanent residents, we have to look at the broader picture.
Okay, Mike, you are, I guess, going to have to break the tie here. We've heard one view which says that we haven't turned this program down nearly enough. We have another view that says, well, don't, pump the brakes a bit here. We need all this. Did the government find the sweet spot here?
Yeah, I'm going to have to agree with Jim. Actually, I might even go farther than Jim. I always find the examples of why we need this program. Everybody mentions the sort of ag stream, and I can understand that. My family's farmers, I get that. Or they mention, yeah, we've got some plant in rural Newfoundland that can't find someone. But if we look at the low-wage stream in particular, it's largely in big cities, people hiring fast food workers and that kind of thing, right? So if there are these edge cases, then, we can keep those edge cases. But when you've got, the ice cream shop next to Fanshawe College in London, Ontario, bringing in temporary foreign workers, we should be asking some questions. Bloomberg reports that there are over 700 temporary foreign workers that work at Tim Hortons locations across Ontario. I don't think that makes sense. And I think, this argument about the median wage, I think it's just an indication that the median wage is too low, right? I can't find a 5-cent cigar, but it doesn't mean that the government should be helping me find that. We have to understand how supply and demand dynamics work. And if there is a shortage, then, wages should go up. That's what is supposed to happen in a capitalist economy. But for some reason, that dynamic that we accept for prices, when we say, okay, there's not enough carrots, so the price of carrots go up, all of a sudden we don't allow the same thing to happen on wages. When there's a shortage of fast food workers, then those wages should go up, rather than saying, no, we've got to keep the median wage where it is and then fill in the blanks with temporary foreign workers.
Dan, if we have a situation where the fast food place right next to Fanshawe College, is that the example you gave, Mike, now? I can't remember. Was it a Wendy's or a Timmy Hortons?
Ice cream place.
Ice cream place,
next to Fanshawe
right.
College.
Okay. If temporary foreign workers are working there, is that evidence of the fact that employers may be abusing this program?
No, not at all. Look, the example that was trotted out many, many times is that my kid had a difficult time getting a summer job. Therefore, it must be the temporary foreign workers that are taking those jobs away. And even if there was some truth to that at all, what is the employer to do when the kids are back in school? Like, how do you find, as an employer, how do you actually prepare an entire roster of workers if you're just making them up? Of my 15-year-old son who works a four-hour shift once a week at the grocery store. You can't do that. You need to make sure that we look at the demographics of the country as a whole. There are some huge benefits of the temporary foreign worker program, even compared to other of the immigration streams. For example, it allows the employer to be involved, so the person comes to Canada for a specific job in a specific spot. It's not like a permanent residency program where everybody clumps up in a few of the large cities in Canada. It takes away any of the credentials recognition issues because the employer has already said, yes, this worker is qualified to work in my business. I agree that there are some challenges to the program, but to dismiss it and say that there should be no program, as some have suggested, I think is just really, really naive and not a good sense of what's going on in our complicated labor market from coast to coast.
Well, let me put that to Jim, because I did see a piece, an op-ed piece. I can't remember what paper I saw it in about a week ago. Economics professor at Carleton University said, get rid of this program entirely. It's been abused. It's not working anymore. Would you go that far and just get rid of it entirely?
Well, there are special cases, as Mike indicated earlier, where it is sensible to use non-permanent migrant labor, and agriculture is the classic one.
So that's a no then?
The agriculture one has been there long before what we now know as the temporary foreign worker program. Same goes for other industries that might face seasonal demand issues and so on. One of the points Dan raised, that the temporary foreign worker is tied to the particular job that they come for, is actually, I think, one of the biggest dangers of the program. Because they're here and their status in the country mostly depends on that relationship with the employer, it puts them in a very vulnerable position regarding fair treatment, wage payments, health and safety, accommodation, etc. Now, in theory, there are protections for these workers, but in practice, it often doesn't work that way. And the fact that their presence in Canada is tied to that one employer is a recipe for exploitation. So that piece of it should definitely be abolished for everyone. And we should actually, for the people who are in Canada now, we should give them a clear pathway to permanent status. That way we can continue to use their labor as part of our labor market, but without that very insecure, precarious, exploitive arrangement under the temporary foreign worker program.
I should give Dan a chance to comment on how much of that exploitative situation that Jim just described happens in this country.
Look, I have no doubt that there are some just terrible employers who treat their temporary foreign workers and, in fact, their Canadian workers really, really poorly. I have no problem with government agencies throwing the book at these employers, as we have rules in place right now to try to address them. We've got to root those things out. And Jim's right. The program, given that the visa is tied to that job, it does lend itself to that. There's no question that there is that risk, a greater risk in that situation than a Canadian who has full labor market mobility. But we don't just, there are risks from the employer perspective as well, and we've certainly seen fraud the other way. There are risks in every single stream of our immigration program, and we don't suggest that we just shut her down as a result. Where Jim went to, though, I agree with. And we have suggested for decades that the temporary foreign worker program can be best used as a pathway where needed to permanent residency. So if you had that person come to Canada for a year or two, where the employer that sponsored that person to come in paid for their return airfare to and from their home country, that went through all the fees to get them there, if they had that immigrant, they could rely on that person for a couple of years, help them then transition to permanent residency, as is happening in the provincial nominee programs. That, we believe, is the right way to balance the rights of the migrant and the rights of the and the needs of the employer and the economy more broadly.
Okay, Elizabeth, let me get you back in here. Since the announcement was made by the federal government, what changes have you seen, either in your practice or more broadly out there, on all of this?
To be honest, it's not that much. Because this program is a very small subset of the broader even LMIA program. The broader
LMIA, you keep using that acronym.
Yeah. Labor Market Impact Assessment.
There we go.
And the Temporary Foreign Worker Program. So low wage. First of all, I'd like to say low wage does not mean low skilled. Low wage is basically anything that's below the median wage. And, many places, many provinces, that's around the $28 to $29 an hour wage. That
well
is
above
not
minimum wage.
That is not minimum wage at all.
Yeah.
And for many employers, if they had to raise the wages to that level for their businesses, they're going to have to close up shop.
Elizabeth, the low-wage program allows employers to pay less than that median. So we don't know that they're making that median. That is how the low-wage program is defined. So we know that in the 230,000 workers in the low-wage program, they're making less than what you just described. We don't know how much less.
Correct. But if you shut it down completely, then the only way forward is to go high wage, which is to hire workers above that wage. And so if you're expecting most employers to be able to go above that wage, then you're probably looking at a lot of businesses having to close.
Mike, can I get your view on whether or not you believe these changes announced by the federal government, again, trying to find the sweet spot between what employers need and what employees want and need, whether this mix will work?
I think they need to go a lot farther. And to the government's credit, I think they acknowledge that. They mentioned that they're going to do a 90-day consultation where they talk to stakeholders, talk to businesses, talk to labor to figure out what the next steps are. And I think that's entirely reasonable, that you don't want to overcorrect, make some changes, and then realize they don't work and have to scale them back. But I do think we need to go a lot further, that there are legitimate uses of the temporary foreign worker program. Like if we're repairing a nuclear plant and we need to bring in some specialists from overseas with special skills that we don't have here, absolutely, we should do that. That's an appropriate use of the program. But when we're seeing job categories, even in the high wage categories, like administrative assistants, which have gone up something like 20-fold in the last few years, I think, again, we need to start asking some questions. If there really is a shortage of administrative assistants in the city of Toronto, shouldn't that be an opportunity for us to train people who are out of work for those positions? And, I think overall that, we can talk about $28 being high or low and what that means for employers, but let's just remember how much it costs to live in the city of Toronto right now. $28 an hour is not going to get you all that far in a high-cost city. So I don't think it's unreasonable to see wages in Toronto rise to that median level or even higher.
Having said all that, youth unemployment in June of 2024, Jim, was 13.5%. Does that suggest to you that there are a lot of young people nowadays who simply don't want to do the difficult, back-breaking jobs that have been referenced on our discussion here?
Oh, I don't think the unemployment rate reflects a lack of interest in work by young people. I think it reflects a lack of jobs for young people. And in fact, for this past summer, it was the worst summer for returning students since the 1990s. Barely 50% of returning university students could find work in the summer. Now, I don't think that's the fault of the temporary foreign worker program. And one thing I'm cognizant of, Steve, in this whole discussion is we've all got to be very careful it doesn't become a sort of immigration bashing sort of discussion. That would be very dangerous. We've seen that happen in other parts of the world, and immigration has been a great thing for Canada, and absolutely is. But it should be supported immigration where we welcome people, give them the full rights that everyone else has, and full supports to integrate into Canadian society. We have got a bigger unemployment problem that results from high interest rates that we've had, the slowdown in the economy, and that's why unemployment has gone up to 6.4%. The temporary foreign worker program, I don't think has helped that, but is certainly not the main cause of it.
Well, Elizabeth, let me follow up on that with you. What do we think about the optics or what it says to the rest of the world, which obviously is looking at Canada, as we turn the taps a little more open or turn the taps a little more off? What do these changes do to our international reputation as a place for temporary foreign workers to come?
Well, I think it really speaks to, when we're talking about people as commodities, it really puts a negative spin on our policies. When we invite people to come to our country and say, hey, for example, come to our country, you can come here and work, and eventually you can come here and stay. And then later on you say, oh yeah, actually, we changed our mind. We don't really need you here anymore. And people have been here for years. They have been working, and they are still in need by their employers to work for them. They've come here and they have families here. And all of a sudden they say, no, go home. That is very, very negative.
Do you hear those stories from your clients?
Absolutely,
Yeah?
absolutely.
Want to give us an example? Give us a for instance.
For example, many of these work permits are going to expire soon. And you know, the temporary foreign worker program, it's used oftentimes for people to get permanent residence. So if you have a LMIA, that can often
LMIA?
labor market impact assessment. I'm sorry, a labor market impact assessment. Then you can get 50 points, for example, for your permanent residency under arranged employment for express entry. And so a lot of times we see the students who have been here studying, and then they have their post-grad work permits. These work permits cannot be renewed. So what are they going to do in order to stay? They have to ask their employers to help them apply for something like a labor market impact assessment. And so as a result, that is one of the reasons why the applications for the labor market impact assessments have been going up. It's not necessarily that we're bringing that many more workers who aren't already in Canada to stay in Canada.
You want to take a run at that one, Dan?
Sure. Yeah, look, let me give it a shot. I think Elizabeth raises an incredibly important point, and that is we don't want to have, nobody, including employers, wants to have what we see in some European countries where there's lots of people who are there long-term without full labor market rights, and they kind of live as an outside class in society. That's not where we should go in Canada, and I've not talked to any employers who want that to happen. What we have to look at some of the successes here, where that migrants or the temporary foreign workers come to Canada, thrown down some roots in small town Saskatchewan, rural Newfoundland, and then the employer is involved in helping them transition to permanent residency. You can imagine that experience of that new migrant that's come to Canada is so much better and has led to many of these people staying in these rural communities, remote communities, where they would never in a million years have gone if they had come to Canada as a permanent resident. This is why, for example, my home province of Manitoba, that has been an early adopter of the provincial nominee program, has had so much success in changing the fabric of our labor market in Manitoba because they've used it strategically. We also have to acknowledge the temporary foreign worker program and the low-wage stream is one of the only streams that brings in people in some of the sectors that otherwise would be starving. When my ancestors came to Manitoba on my mother's side from Ukraine, they didn't come to work in a lab or a university. They came to work as farmers, and we have basically lost any of the ability of people to come for jobs in entry-level occupational categories other than through the refugee program and the temporary foreign worker program. Because we bring in the best and the brightest. Huge strengths from that, but one of the downsides is that we have a lot of jobs. Demographics are not on our side for people to fill some of the positions in heavier occupational categories with physical demands, night shifts, where people around the world would love to come to Canada for these jobs. Canadians are saying, no, I have no interest in that whatsoever. This is a win-win, and I don't want to dismiss that. This is important.
Mike, I should get you to comment on, since I think you want to turn the taps off even more in this program, on what kind of signal it sends to the rest of the world, if that is in fact what we end up doing.
Well, I think we should be focusing more on permanent residency. When the United Nations calls our programs a breeding ground for contemporary forms of slavery, I think we should try and end that. You know, we should not be a breeding ground for contemporary forms of slavery. Instead, I think we need to be looking at ways to get permanent residency. And I think we absolutely need to keep the experience of the workers who are coming here top of mind. We do them no favors and us no favors if we're exploiting them. So I think it's more than fair for us to be trying to reform these programs and putting a focus on the human rights of migrant workers, because right now we're not doing that, and the United Nations has called us out for it.
All right, with a few minutes to go here, Jim, if we didn't have this program, let's say we do what the fellow from Carleton University suggested, and we scrap this program altogether. What would that do to our economy?
Well, incrementally, it would heighten the pressure on employers to find another solution to their recruitment and retention challenges. Dan was just talking about how these are tough, physical, unpleasant jobs and in general low-paying jobs. And, Canadians don't want to do them. Therefore, we'll use foreign workers to come and do it. How about we try to improve those jobs? And that's partly through lifting the wages and the benefits, as we've talked about. But more importantly, in the long run, frankly, it's also about through innovation and technology and automation and investment in capital. Make those jobs less unpleasant. And it won't be until employers have a hard time finding someone at the wage they want to pay that they'll do the hard work to start thinking, okay, how do I get a different way, a different business model to use machinery and investment and innovation rather than cheap labor.
Jim, I think, Dan, I think I saw you nodding a little bit when Jim was in the midst of his speech there. Does that mean you can sign on to some of that?
Look, there's no question that employers are looking to automate where they can, but my worry about the direction that is headed is that is setting up Canada to be a country of large multinationals that can afford to pay for the innovation and the automation that is required. We're setting it up that Canada would move to being a branch plant economy with big industrial players coming in. And it seems in some ways that we have no problem with those administrative assistants having those jobs completely offshored to other countries, which technology is now enabling much, much faster than if we actually brought somebody into Canada to pay all of the taxes in Canada. I don't know. We got to look at this from a holistic picture. And if you look at the demographics as to where we're headed, yes, the unemployment rate has ticked up a little bit, but long term, my goodness, do we need people in some of these occupational categories that are going begging. Technology is great, but it's not here, and it's not widespread, and it's certainly not easily adopted by SMEs who in rural, remote communities will disappear if this program is shut down too hard.
Acronym-free zone, Dan. Small, medium enterprises, is that what you're talking about?
Small and medium-sized enterprises. My apologies.
There we go. I should ask Mike, I can't remember if your kids are of age enough to get summer jobs, but did they manage to get something this summer if they were of age?
So my oldest is only 13, so she's not quite there yet. Okay. But some of my neighbor kids are having all kinds of trouble. This is the worst summer we've had for teenage employment outside of 2020, the lockdown year. I think we need to be looking at productivity, right? That you go to a coffee shop and you see opening the coffee things and putting them in and pouring the coffee and that kind of thing. Go, can we find machines to do that? Other countries, their fast food restaurants are far more automated. And we should also be clear that this program is largely used by large employers. And many of the small and medium enterprises who use these programs are franchisees of a larger international conglomerate. So yes, the person that owns the local Tim Hortons is a small and medium enterprise. They're a franchisee, but they're doing so under the auspices of a larger corporation. So we should be clear about that. This is not just SMEs using this program. This is used by big businesses all across Canada, and the franchisees under those large corporations.
As I thank you all for joining us tonight, let the record show Dan Kelly shook his head when you just said that, Mike. So we'll put that on the record. Dan Kelly, CEO, President of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. Mike Moffat, Director of the Smart Prosperity Institute. We thank you for joining us in Points Beyond. Elizabeth Long, LM Law. Jim Stanford, economist and Director of the Center for Future Work. Thank you for joining us here in the studio. Great to have you all aboard tonight.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
The effects of government policies like the Indian Act and the residential school system are still felt by Indigenous people today. Journalist and author Tanya Talaga explores this enduring legacy in her new book, The Knowing, where she retells Canadian history through an Indigenous lens and tracks her family history all the way back to her great-great-grandmother, Annie. She's a columnist with the Globe and Mail and founder of Makwa Creative Production Company, and Tanya joins us in studio for more. Thank you so much for joining us.
For sure.
Let's talk about Annie. The book centers around her. Who is she?
Annie is my great-great-grandmother, and I didn't know very much about her. I didn't know anything about her at all, and it was actually my mom, who is in her 80s. She's 80 years old, actually, and it was my mom who's been constantly asking me to find Annie, find her great-grandma. She knew that she was somewhere buried in Toronto, but she didn't know where she was. And for a long time, was given this file folder from my uncle Hank Bowen after he passed away, full of all of his family information. It had birth certificates, it had marriage certificates, death certificates, and it was this huge puzzle. We were trying to find our relations. He was trying to find Annie, his grandma, and also find out any information he could about his mom, Liz, and why she was so silent and just didn't say anything about where she was from, which Indian residential school she attended, how come she didn't speak her language, why she wasn't proud to be who she was. It was like almost like a giant black hole about her past. And so Annie was her mom. Uncle Hank was looking for Annie for over 80 years. And when he died, that fell to me. My mom has been saying to me, please, let's find her. And that is what this book is about, and the journey we've been on is about.
As a journalist, you know, there are plenty of barriers in finding information, but this is a unique challenge. Thankfully, you have that folder with some starting points, but walk me through some of the barriers that you faced trying to find some of the historical records on Annie.
Well, as I said, my Uncle Hank, he started this, and he started this in the age before the internet. And so there was no Google search that he could go to. The NCTR records were not online. When he was searching, he was looking in the 70s, 80s, 90s. He would constantly write letters to government officials trying to find information out about his mom, Liz. And he would get letters back from the government, the dot matrix printer. I have so many copies from the Department of Indian Affairs or from the Ontario government's Vital Statistic branch that says we have no record of Liz Gauthier being born from 1900 to 1910. It was like she just totally did not exist, right, as a person. And that was sort of the beginning of his odyssey, and something he was constantly hitting his head against the wall. Well, how come no one can help me? I know she exists. I know she was a First Nations woman because look at me. And how come there's nothing about her? And the story of finding Annie really magnifies the story of all of our families, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit families, looking for their lost loved ones. People, our family members that went to Indian residential school, that went to Indian hospitals, tuberculosis, sanitaria, asylums, they didn't come home. We all have stories in our family of people who didn't come home. And so the search for records, for accurate records, is something that all of us are experiencing if you are an Indigenous person. Mm-hmm. We are lucky if we can go back at all to the 1840s. I was able to go back that far, and that was with monumental help. But access to records shouldn't be that difficult, But if you're a family member looking for a lost loved one, it is. Why is that? Because if you are an Indian, your records have been destroyed. They are no longer available. They've been thrown out. They've been misfiled. They're written down wrong. I can't tell you how many times we see the spelling of a name totally.
Times, right?
Yeah. I have one relation. His last name is spelled 7 different times. It's crazy.
That is crazy. I want to pick up on the help that you got, because you got a lot of help. There's a lot of different organizations that are doing a lot of important work in trying to collect these records. Tell me a little bit about that, because it also leads you into Facebook, where you kind of find some relations there.
Yeah. Well, it's not that much of a mystery, but all First Nations people love Facebook. It's how we all communicate on Facebook Messenger. So the story was it was actually a fan of mine, someone who had read my books. His name is Ryan Shackleton, and he has a company called No History. He had read Seven Fallen Feathers and All Our Relations, and he is an archivist. He is a researcher. He works in Ottawa, and that's what he does. He knows how to find information. And I've been an investigative journalist for a couple of decades. I know how to find information, but even this was a stumbling block to me. It's like, how do I find out anything about Annie? All we had was a death certificate, really, that said that she died here at the Ontario Hospital in 1937. And so Ryan mentioned to me, you know, if you ever need help with anything, let me know. And so I called him up one day and I said, you know what, I actually need your help. And he said, okay, no problem. And it was Ryan that actually found the census from 1881 that showed that Annie, her last name was really Carpenter, and that she was born in 1871. She was 10 years old at the time of the 1881 census in Fort Albany. So that's along the James Bay coast. And there she was, Annie with an E. And she had brothers and sisters and parents, and it was listed she was a Cree Indian, and that, you know, it was just amazing to me that she was brought alive by looking at this census record. And from that starting point, I was able to start looking, Ryan was able to start looking, and as soon as I found out that she was from Fort Albany, I was like, oh my gosh, I mean, I know people from Fort Albany. I have been on the Albany River, Saskatchewan, before as a reporter, as a journalist. I have covered stories about the Ring of Fire for over 10 years. And so I reached out to people that I knew there, Mike Metatwabin and his brother Edmund. And I also, on Facebook, I found this page that said James Bay Community, you know, FYI. And I'm like, well, I've got a question. Right. And so I asked, does anyone know anything about the Carpenter family? And within like 45 minutes, Paula Rickert, who is a genealogist from Moose Cree First Nation, she got back to me. And it was actually Paula that really unlocked most of the secrets of my family on the maternal side. She was the one that knew all about the Carpenters. And she goes, oh yeah, I've got them all on my family tree. And she goes, you're related to this person, this person, this person. And it's really amazing. She has a tree of 13,000 names of Cree, all related along the James Bay, Hudson Bay coast, all the way down to Norway House, actually.
I want to talk about the book's name, The Knowing. What does that mean to you?
Sort of gets back to what I was saying earlier, too, about how every First Nations family and community, we have people that just did not come home. We all know about a great uncle or a brother or a friend, someone who just disappeared. We don't know what happened to them, but we know that they're gone. Fast forward to Kamloops. 3 years ago, I was at Kamloops, Teshwatma, for the discovery of the 215. When that was first announced, I was one of the journalists that was invited to come to the community and to report on the story. And when I was there, I kept hearing everybody talking about the knowing. We all knew family members that did not come home. And as soon as I heard that phrase, and that was what the community was using as well, I just knew, wow, this is exactly like what's in my family and in all the families, First Nations families that I know. It is a knowing. And so to me, the book had to be called The Knowing.
All right, I want to read a little excerpt from your book. It reads, every single First Nations, Métis, and Inuit family has a story like ours, has lived through a similar trauma. Every single family. Not one was left unscathed by the demonizing policies of the Canadian government and those of the provinces, the British Crown, and the Christian churches. Laws were written with the sole intent of crushing First Nations into submission so that the colonizers could easily take the land and everything on it or underneath it. This is a hard but true reality for Canadians to realize, but it is one that Indigenous peoples have always known. I want to pull up a photo, a black and white photo. This is a photo of women sitting along a fence during the signing of Treaty 9 in 1905. You mention this photo a lot throughout your book because there is perhaps some relevance to Annie here. What's happening here in this photo?
Yeah, so this is a kind of a fascinating story. It's something that really I discovered, of course, on this search for Annie. So what I did was I tried to trace her steps through the records that I could find, that Paula could find, that No History could find. I tried to find what happened to Annie after she left Fort Albany. She married a man named Samson Wemestigoose. Paula discovered this, and he was from Moose Cree First Nation. Turns out he was my great-great-grandfather. He was married to Annie. And he passed away in the early 1900s. Annie went with her brother and her sister-in-law, and some other family members, and they went up the Saskatchewan, so the Albany River, and the head of the river is at St. Joseph's, and that is actually Osnaburg Post. Today, its rightful name is Mishkigaugamang First Nation, and why that's important was because in 1905, Annie is captured there on the Mishkigaugamang pay list, treaty pay list, and it is the pay list that was created at the signing of Treaty Number 9, the very first stop of Treaty Number 9's signing. And why this is also incredibly fascinating is that Duncan Campbell Scott, the architect of the Indian residential school system, he designed and signed and created one treaty, and that was Treaty Number 9. And he was there at Osnaburg at that time when Annie was there with her brother Joseph and with her daughter Christina, all this information that we were finding out. And it was right there, believe it or not, on the Government of Ontario's own website for just celebrating Treaty Week. You know, they have this pay list, and you can see Annie's name is right on there, along with Charlotte Carpenter and Joseph Carpenter and all of these people. It's quite astounding. Anyway, so this picture that you see is a photo that Duncan Campbell Scott took himself. He used to take all of these pictures, and you could look in the Library Archives Canada and you'll see all of his, in his fonds, all of these photos that he took. And these are the women that were there at the time of the treaty signing, and they were waiting for a feast to start. And so every time I look at this picture, I think to myself, Annie is probably somewhere in this photo. And where is she? Because I don't have a photo of her. I don't know what she looks like.
That's fascinating. I want to read another excerpt from your book. And it starts, "The closer I get to Annie, to retracing her steps, the more alive she becomes to me. Her reality, along with those of my great-grandmother Liz, my grandmother Margaret, my mother. I see the weave of their lives, the immense ground they covered, the adversity they faced to make sure their children did not live through what they did. They survived to make sure the next 7 generations thrive." You write about the effects of these systems on all Indigenous people, but how would your female relatives have felt with the impacts of government policies especially?
Well, it really shaped their lives, you know. The more I found out about Annie and her story when she was born, 1871, 5 years before the Indian Act, a racist piece of legislation, became law in Canada, 1876. And this was also 1871, the year of her birth, was right after Rupert's Land, this giant fur trading block of land, which I call a plantation in the book, because it truly was, where Indigenous people were engaged in the fur trade, were part of it. They were working for the HBC. They were governed by folks that had ties to the slave trade in Britain, Great Britain. All the HBC governors came from there. And you could see the formulation of Canadian policy in the thoughts of who created Canada, the foundations of Canada. Where did that come from? Where did these policies, like policies of erasure, come from in North America? Where did the Indian Act come from? The thoughts of having Indian residential schools come from? What was behind all of that? And so Rupert's Land was sold to Sir John A. Macdonald around the same time of Annie's birth. And so when you ask that question, you can see, and I say this in the book, that Annie and her daughter Liz and her other children, they were born in the mouth of genocide. The beginnings of something, the policies that were constructed to assimilate, destroy, and to remove our people off the land so settlers could come here and build the country of Canada that we now know today. And so when you look at that, and when you look at what happened to Annie in her life, she was enfranchised. When she was in her later 30s, she had lost Samson, her husband. She had lost her 5 children to Indian residential school, to disease. She was a young widow. She marries a French-Canadian man, and that act erased her identity. She was no longer an Indian under the eyes of Canadian law. She was cast out of all that she knew. And the funny thing was is the Canadian government at the time thought this was a great promotion, like a reason to celebrate. Oh, she's no longer an Indian. She's married to a white man now.
Right.
But that act really just was a massive act of erasure. And then from there, too, Annie was somehow, and we don't really know why, but in 1930, she was taken to the Ontario Hospital, which is on the grounds of Humber College now. Humber College, you'll notice the really old-looking buildings. That was the Ontario Hospital, which was an asylum, an insane asylum. And we have, also another term for it at the time, and we have no idea why she was taken there and why she was never allowed to leave. And she died there in 1937.
Incredible story. I want to talk about a trip that you took. Through this period of doing all this research and connecting with family and hearing stories of family that you weren't even looking for but stumbled across. There's a lot of emotion in your travels to Rome in 2022. You go with a contingent of Indigenous leaders and survivors who are seeking an official apology from the Pope. What was that trip like?
It was wild, to be honest with you. I went because I knew I was, of course, writing this book. And so I went as a journalist as well. I wanted to be there. So, I paid my own way to go. I was not part of the official delegation. I was just the press on there watching, and I was lucky, very lucky to go. It was wild. I mean, from the time that we were sitting in the airport in Montreal, all waiting to get on a plane all together to go to Rome, I didn't realize that we'd all be taking the same plane together. So all of the Catholic bishops, for example, and the clergy from Canada, they were all with us on this plane filled with Métis, Inuit, and First Nations survivors. Wilton Littlechild was there. He was one of the TRC commissioners. Viv Timmins was there. She's a survivor from St. Anne's. I knew all of these people that were there. Lisa LaFlamme was there. And I remember her sort of swanning in, and it was just like, wow, there's a celebrity in our midst. And there we were, and it was just a really strange time. We get on this plane, we go to Rome, then we get into these giant buses, and it felt like we were on tour, like it was part of a vacation package or something. And there was a tour guide, literally, that she was working, I guess, to facilitate things and make things better for us. But she was pointing out the strangest things, though, like, there's Via Christophe Colombo, for instance.
Right.
Well, for a pile of Indigenous people, that's not really.
And you were given a reminder on that bus as well,
that
what really this trip is all about.
Exactly. So there were some really weird times like that. And then there were times where, like, Elder Fred Kelly from Treaty 3, for instance, stood up on the bus right before we went to the Vatican Museum and said, let's take a moment here to remember why we are here. All of the family members we have lost are women that we are still losing, what has happened to our people because of colonization and because of the Christian church. And he was one of the spiritual advisors that the Assembly of First Nations had brought with us. And it was just like a wonderful reminder. And I remember just being grounded in that moment. Like, you can never really forget, but that was just a beautiful, beautiful memory.
We have less than a minute left, and I want to show this photo to our listeners and our watchers. This is a photo of your mother, Sheila, when you were finally able to visit Annie's grave. It's not giving too much away for the potential readers, but what was it like to finally get to this moment?
It was a lot. It was a really emotional day. My mom was with us, my daughter Natasha, and there we were. And she had been looking her whole life for Annie. And since my mom had moved to Toronto, she had been looking for Annie. And there we were. We finally found her. And there's a little bit of a funny story actually with this, is that when we first got to the cemetery, it was Ed Januszewski who found the cemetery and who cleared the land with all of his activism and his help, because it really is in the middle of Toronto. It's just off the Queen Elizabeth Way on the way to Sherway Gardens, just south of the giant IKEA.
A path that you drive every day.
You drive it all the time, right? And there's this, it was a dog run. It was just the size of a city block, and it was overgrown. There was garbage being thrown in there, but it was a graveyard. There are 1,511 people buried there, and only 10% have grave markers. So Ed and his team, he formed a team, the Lakeshore Cemetery Project, and they petitioned the government to have this cleared and a fence put around it. And so that's what he did 20 years ago. If there are any heroes in Annie's story, it's Ed. And so from Ed, we were able to find this little piece of, well, the plot where she was. But when he first took us there, he took us to the wrong grave site. And then we were smudging and crying and talking to Annie, but it turns out we weren't. We were talking to some non-Indigenous guy that happened to die and was lying there. But then he took us to where she was. And then, it was just, it's a moment that I will never forget, nor will my mother. And we go visit her. We still visit her. And of course now the search for Annie, because of that search, Kimberly Murray from the Office of the Special Interlocutor for Missing Children and Unmarked Graves, she helped us form a group with Anishinaabe Nation, Anishinaabe Aski Nation, Grand Council Treaty Number 3, and now we're looking for all of the First Nations people that are buried there. We're looking for their families. Oh, wow. So Finding Annie has found 32 other First Nations people that are buried in that cemetery. And so now we're trying to find their families and locate them.
The work continues. Tanya, thank you so much. A well-researched book and really important one. So thank you so much. The Knowing is available now in a docu-series, as you mentioned, will be out on CBC later this month. Thank you.
Chimigwech.
And that is the agenda for Thursday, September 5th, 2024. Tomorrow on the program, John Michael McGrath, JMM, and I will talk about all things Queen's Park in our first new episode of the season of On Polly, and we hope you will join us for that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.